Hi, my friends. Welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, your host, and also an indie author. I'm thrilled you're joining me today for another fun interview with a passionate author. We're going to kick off this show with an exciting reading, so let's get started.
Hi, DC, and thank you so much for having me today. I just discovered you a few weeks ago, and I've been listening to your podcast every single day while I'm out on my walk. I thank you very much for bringing our voices forward as authors. So I'm Lynn McLaughlin, and I'm also a podcast host. Mine's called Taking the Helm, where I bring forward people who've experienced crisis in their lives and they found new possibilities. I'm an award-winning author for my first book, which was called Steering Through It. I also run something to help aspiring authors called Time to Publish, to help people through all of the mistakes that I made the first time around as an indie author, trying to save people time and money. I'm most excited about my next book, which will have been launched on October 22nd, and the book is called Jackson. Just a little bit of the background of Jackson. So Jackson has two main characters in it, a mother named June and her 25-year-old son named Jackson. I take the readers all the way back to Jackson's childhood and reflections because Jackson ends up being diagnosed with a mental illness. And there are signs all along the way that the mother and he himself reflect upon where possibly they could have changed things. Possibly they could have accepted his mental illness sooner as opposed to thinking there might be a quick fix. That's just one part of it. So you really have two stories going. You have the mother desperate to save her son, to do whatever she can. She puts her own health and her own wellness aside to the point where she really can't function anymore. She's so nervous about the next phone call. What's going to happen? Will he get through the day? And then we have Jackson, who doesn't accept and is one of the many people with mental illness who turn to addictions and external validation. And he moves through a process where he eventually accepts his mental illness. And the end of the book, it ends with hope and love. So I've chosen one passage from the perspective of June, the mother. The first call was one that will be forever ingrained in my heart and in my memory. It was quite late, and I was turning off the lights, getting ready for bed. The phone rang, which set off my radar. We rarely received calls then after 10 p.m. Jackson was mumbling, attempting to say something in between his sobs. Alarmed, I initially thought that he'd been in an accident of some sort, and I kept saying, "I'm here," in as soft a voice and as quiet a voice as I could. It was all I could do to not start crying, but I knew I had to be there for him. I thought that maybe if I modeled deep breathing, I could help him calm. I maneuvered over to the living room where Craig, my husband, had been reading. I didn't need to explain. My facial expression, nonverbal language, and words were telling. He knew Jackson was in crisis. After some time, Jackson was still breathing heavily, but he was able to speak. He was hard to understand, but I was sure he was drunk. He said he couldn't do it anymore. He didn't want to live. He'd had enough. We knew we needed to keep him on the phone. I was in shock, but somehow I kept going. Where had all this come from? Were we being taken back in time? But this time it was in much more of a terrifying way. Our son wanted to take his own life. Craig and I jumped into the car and drove to his apartment as I tried to keep him engaged in any conversation. We were reacting, moving on instinct. Craig had been desperately trying to dial his phone to contact one of Jackson's roommates to no avail. The streetlights flashed past us as we raced to our son, arriving in just over 15 minutes. Doors slamming, we both bolted to the apartment entrance. I still had the phone against my ear as we knocked furiously on the door. It slowly cracked open as the security chain was unbolted, and Jackson haltingly opened the door. Chris, his roommate, was standing in the doorway of his bedroom and slowly closed it behind him as he went inside. Jackson stood there for what seemed forever, but was merely a second, avoiding eye contact and looking down at the floor. He then turned, moving through the main living area to his room. I walked into our son's room first, with Craig behind me. Through dim lamplight, our son appeared, turning towards us as he sat on the edge of the bed, disheveled. Clothing was all over the floor of the darkened room, and the air was thick and stale. Empty pop cans and vodka bottles were strewn everywhere. Our son was much calmer now as I sat beside him, putting my arm over his shoulder. Craig stood before us, unsure of what to do. With a shaky voice, Jackson disclosed that he did not want to live anymore. I can't deal with anything. I'm so tired. I just don't care. He told us he'd had a plan to take his own life by overdose, but stopped because he couldn't bear the thought of anyone finding him, knowing how traumatic it would be for Chris or Carl, his roommates. He was crying for help. We did not ask what happened. It didn't matter in that moment. I couldn't breathe. I was shaking. Craig's face was ashen with concern. Holding back our own tears, we both hugged Jackson as he stared down at the floor. No judgment, no questions, or rushing to act. After a few minutes, Craig suggested he come with us to the hospital, and he immediately stood up and asked for a couple of minutes to get changed and gather some things. Craig stood at the bedroom door while he did so, not able to take his eyes off his son, still fearful he would do something rash. It then seemed somber, oddly peaceful, as we drove through the city. I sat in the back seat, holding Jackson's hands, repeating, "We're here for you. You're not alone. We love you. You'll get through this." As he stared out the window, slumped in the seat, Jackson showed no emotion and remained silent. If I could only read his mind, what would this night bring? We entered the emergency room, and as I held his hand, he began to trail behind me. The waiting area was full of visibly ill people who all seemed to be staring at us as we approached the triage window. Really, I thought? You want us to sit here in front of all of these people and disclose verbally that our son wants to take his own life? Fast forward a little bit. This was more than real. It was terrifying. I couldn't think clearly. We now had a safety plan as a family. Not a plan to escape a fire in our home, a plan to help keep our son alive. A plan that had no guarantees that our son had full control of. Jackson needed to know what to do when he was feeling overwhelmed, other than binge drinking. If he could identify triggers and see the warning signs, he could use strategies to get support and follow his plan if he was in crisis. But he needed to want to. Medication was introduced by the psychiatrist to help deal with the symptoms of depression. Jackson, however, described himself as just not caring. Our hearts were breaking. "I just don't care, Mom. Don't you get it? It doesn't matter. Nothing matters." Imagine your child, one you've had such hope and love for, not finding his place in the world. We needed to learn to listen without judgment and to validate how our son was feeling. This was the first of more incidents to come. We were the most important part of his support network now.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Inside the Minds of Author. Today, we have the amazing Lynn McLaughlin with us today, which just gave us a really passionate reading. By the way, I have goosebumps everywhere. So this is such a really powerful topic that you're bringing to us. So how about we start, Madame, with how are you feeling today?
Well, a little emotional after reading that passage in the book, but it's a privilege to be here and to share these stories. It's a compilation of real life stories. I met with several people who'd had experiences. It's very emotional and moving, but I'm very hopeful it's going to help people get through what we would consider unthinkable in dealing with mental illness in our own families.
This is such a huge topic that sometimes we don't talk a lot about it, and it can be very hard to deal with. You were definitely emotional because I could feel your words as you were reading them to us, and I could feel that mother's pain and suffering. What made you decide to actually tackle this?
Well, it goes back to, so I retired 2 years ago as an educator, and I had been in lots of different roles, a teacher, a vice principal, a principal, and my last 6 years were as a superintendent. And the biggest part of my portfolio was special education. In those last 5 to 6 years, the number of our students that were experiencing mental illness, mental health crises, specifically, I would say particularly anxiety to be the highest one, and depression then following, it was just growing exponentially. And each one of these students was struggling, but not only themselves, but their families, their parents, their guardians. That was part of it. And then I also, in my own family network, in my friends, many of my friends were dealing with this as parents as well. What do you do when your child is self-injurious or is turning to addiction as a parent, you want to do anything you can to help your child, but you don't have the tools. There's no manual. There's no manual to do this. And then one of my three children, my middle child, was an anxious child growing up. But when she moved away to university, it was 3 years of, she hit rock bottom more than once. So then it was home as a mother. So all of these experiences together, I thought there's got to be a way to help people. And I see this twofold in this book. It's helping parents and guardians see this path of this one mother. And the mother is a compilation of experiences of all of those people. I actually met with several people, turned on my recorder, listened to their stories, and all of those stories formed June, the mom. And I did the same thing for Jackson. I do have to give credit to one woman. Her name is Yvonne Mars. She's an author out of England. And I reached out to an online club on Facebook called Women Writers. And I said, I really need someone to help me get in the mind of this character. I just couldn't put myself in Jackson's head. And Yvonne helped me tremendously create an anxious mind to the point where I understood what that felt like, to the degree that I could, having never experienced it. Yeah, that's what brought it all to fruition.
It is an amazing journey you're bringing the readers to. Just that piece that you read for us, it is that perspective of a parent feeling helpless. As a child, you never think your parents could feel helpless. They're supposed to be able to handle anything. But that entire feeling and that sense of, I know it didn't take that long, but it felt like forever. So when you were creating June and even her husband, were you able to put yourself in those places?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I've been on the other side of the table with friends and myself as a parent too, in trying to figure out how to get our children through each one of these crises. Part of June, I would say 30% of June is me and my experiences. And I would say part of Jackson, probably about the same. 30% of Jackson is really my daughter's experiences. So it's very close to home.
It is a journey that every reader is going to enjoy. Where would you characterize this book as? What is it, the genre that we're looking at?
It's fictional because it's a compilation of experience. So they're fictional characters. It's also, you'll find it under self-help and family relationships.
The combination of a self-help book created as a story makes it very interesting, because normally you read a self-help book and it has do step 1, do step 2, do step 3, but the story brings it to life. So when you were creating this, did you always knew this was going to be a self-help book?
No, I did not. I wasn't even
Okay.
sure when I was writing it if we would even be calling it fictional. I thought, well, maybe I'll give credit to each one of the people. Actually, every single person I spoke to said they didn't want to be credited. They were happy to be part of the journey to tell the stories.
You made the decision to create a fictional book with a story. When did you decide that that's why you were going to do it?
I would say it was probably 8 months ago when I had the draft in my hands and I was calling around to publishers to decide which way I was going to go as an indie author. Would I go hybrid? Would I do it myself? So by that time, I knew what it was going to look like.
Do you have a target audience in mind for this book, or is it open to anybody? Who are you looking that will benefit from this book?
That's a fantastic question, DC. I mean, it will raise awareness. I have three goals with this book. One of them is to raise awareness, understanding, and acceptance of people who are struggling with mental illness. We need to push the judgment aside. We need to have an understanding. So even if this isn't touching your own life, reading this book is going to help to raise awareness for you. I think it will most definitely help parents and guardians who are struggling, friends of people who have a child who's struggling. And I certainly hope it's helping young people who themselves are facing mental illness. I hope it helps them to understand, and all of us to understand, there is no simple fix. There is no kiss to the forehead, as the introduction says. It's a process. But by seeking external validation, as Jackson does, Jackson uses marijuana, Jackson does binge drinking, he ends up in a narcissistic relationship. All of these kinds of things are happening because he is in the place of blame. It's not my fault. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. And you follow Jackson's journey all the way through the book to the point when he does realize he had control all along. He just had to take the first step, and then the next step, and the next step. It doesn't end with perfection, but it does end with hope, because Jackson has a realization that he does have a mental illness and he will have it his entire life, but he can be happy and successful with it if he knows how to cope and move forward.
That is such a powerful message that anybody can use, regardless whether you have a mental disability or a physical disability, is can you embrace your current situation? Can you embrace your current life and be happy now? Whew, that's a lot,
Mhm.
madam. That is a
It's
lot.
a lot. It's a lot. You follow June. June gets to the point where the phone rings and she's on pins and needles. She can't sleep at night. She's constantly looking to see if there's been a message. She's creeping her son on social media to see, has he posted, because I haven't heard from him in 6 hours. She gets to a point where she has to do something, or she's going to find herself in a situation where she could be hospitalized herself.
She has become self-consumed with her son and not living her
Yes,
own life.
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
The parallel between the two of them is a very codependent relationship, but neither one of them sees it.
Yeah, codependency is part of this journey for sure.
Huge themes, huge message coming together, but from a perspective of being vulnerable, which is amazing. It is bringing a light to a subject that most people haven't thought about it, are not aware unless they're living it. Tell us, madam, this is not your first book. What other books have you written? Tell us a little bit about that as well.
Well, I published my first book in 2017. It was called Steering Through It. That was my family story about a year in our lives where I had been diagnosed with a brain tumor. I was just finished my first year as a superintendent. I had ignored symptoms for far too long. And that was really my goal of that book, to get people to be aware. I mean, I put myself in jeopardy. I was a walking death trap. So this book was written, it was launched. So I was a new indie author. Last August in 2019, I put up the second edition and fixed all of the things I didn't know about the first time around. I had reviews and testimonials by that point, and I knew how to market. So yeah, those were the first two books. And I'm proud to say it's won several awards. The audiobook has won an award as well. And I've had great affirmation from people saying it's helped them to get through not just a life-threatening diagnosis. I've had people experiencing divorce that have said the book was very helpful because I ask questions to the readers. You know, what would you do if you were faced with this? Would you tell your children openly about your illness? You know, there's lots of questions and reflections about what's our biggest purpose in life too. It all comes through in Steering Through It.
Blown away on this side of the mic. What can I say? You are not just a powerful emotional writer, but you open your soul up to us, which is beautiful. And I am so thankful that you come in on this show with us. That takes a whole lot of courage to put your message and put yourself out there. You do very memoirs kind of books. Did you always thought you were going to write them?
I loved reading as a child. I was a Nancy Drew fan. I read every book one after another. And in grade 7 in my elementary school, the teacher librarian put out a contest, a writing contest. So I wrote this cute little book called My Family Story. And it really was, my father was a musician. He was a lead singer in a band, and he was always gone. So we were really 4 kids raised alone by our mom. Back in those days, you know, the late 60s, early 70s, it was odd. There'd be parent teacher conferences and only my mom would go. There'd be a father daughter dance and I couldn't go. And so I wrote this book called My Family House, I think it was called. And I entered the contest and I won first, second, and third prize. I really don't think anyone else entered.
It's all good.
But
Don't
I
worry
still
about it.
won,
You still won.
and I think that was the initiation. And then I wrote some poetry anonymously in high school. A couple of things were published in the yearbooks. And then journaling is something that I always did. But did I ever think that I would actually publish a book? I guess I was hopeful, but then life took over. I had a career. My husband was a police officer. We had 3 kids, all growing up, all doing different things. But after my year of being ill, and I had journaled through that entire thing, I knew I had to write that book. And now this experience, you know, this compilation of experiences. And it's interesting because the first one is a memoir. And because this one isn't my personal experience, it's fictional. I'm looking next year to do a children's book. I just want to, I don't know, change it up, I guess.
There is nothing wrong with exploring different genres as long as you're feeling the passion coming through them, and you are. I find it to be absolutely empowering that you can take something as traumatizing as a brain injury and you decided, you know what, I'm going to do something positive with this and I'm going to help others. How do you feel about that connection with your readers when you invite them into your life? How did that feel?
I love it. I love it. And you know, the best part of it is when you go onto Amazon or Goodreads or Facebook and there's a testimonial or someone's called you or reached out to you to say, can we talk about this? This is 7 years ago. August 7th was my craniotomy. So 7 years ago. And I just had 2 people whose cousin was diagnosed reach out to me to say, can you help? I won't help with diagnosis or anything, but I can certainly help you to find resources through foundations, through not-for-profits, to understand the research. I do a newsletter every month. I hate the word newsletter, but it's called Lynn's Blitz. And I always include a piece about research because a lot of my readers are looking for that.
It is that connection. It is providing your readers, your fan base, and the people that come into your life with the resources, and you've been there. So it's not like you're preaching to people. You're just sharing your story and making those connections, which is absolutely amazing to everybody.
You know, if it hasn't touched you yet, what we're sharing in Jackson, I'll speak to the Canadian statistics. In any given year, 1 in 5 of us is going to have a mental illness or an addiction problem. And by the time we're 40, 1 out of 2 of us will have had or are going to have a mental illness. So if it's not touching you now, it's going to touch you in some way, shape, or form. Maybe not personally, but someone you know, someone you love, and someone you care about. It's time to talk about it. It's time to put it out there.
It's one of those really hard subjects to discuss. I usually tell a lot of my close friends I suffer from depression since I had thyroid cancer, and having to educate my parents on that. I come from a very Dominican culture, and my culture is not very aware of it. They don't understand it. You know, you talked about that mother, June, and having to face her child. Like the moment you read her passage, I wonder, oh my God, how do my parents felt? Because there's nothing they could have done. We're 1,500 miles apart. But I understand that discussion. And from a person who suffers from it, trying to open up to somebody who doesn't understand can feel very, very judgmental. So I am so happy. I told you when we connected, I'm glad you brought this to the light. I am ecstatic you wrote this book, but I'm also so thrilled that you have resources because that's what we need. And a lot of the times I can give you information, but if I don't know how to give you resources for it, then am I giving you the whole picture?
Well, and the back of the book, I do actually include an entire section on resources, signs and symptoms to watch for in a friend or a loved one where you need to intervene, a whole bunch of resource links for anybody who's looking for information. Now, it's focused on Canadian links, but I also make a statement in there. I mean, they're everywhere. Wherever you live, there are resources available. And the other piece I discuss at the end of the book, too, is traditional therapy isn't the answer for a lot of people. And DC, I don't know if you've experienced this, but there are a lot of alternative experiences now and types of therapy that are bringing people to new understandings and awareness. So I think it behooves us to help people find what's going to work for them, help them to take that, at least that first step of accepting that they need to get help.
It is absolutely not a one size all kind of thing. I do a lot of alternative medicine. I'm a meditator, which as an ADD kind of kid, I never thought that would be me, but it has changed my life. So yes, I have completely agreed. It is not a one size. It is not everything that we see on the news or the TV is going to work for everybody. It is going through that journey and opening up yourself to say, what is it going to fit my life and my family? And I love it. And you're right. You can take resources from Canada. You can take them from the US. You can take them across the world, resources that there. We should be willing to open enough to see it.
Agreed.
So, madam, as a memoir writer and as a fiction writer, taking very personal experience and bringing them to life, what advice would you give a new author who's trying to go on this journey?
Right. Right now, I mean, my goodness, our lives have all been turned upside down in the last 6 months. So, you know, this is easy for me to say when I have 3 grown children, but if you've been homeschooling for the last 6 months and you want to write, it's a little bit different. But it is about having a plan, and it's about getting your thoughts on paper. Get them on paper first. Get them all compiled, and then start to think about what you're going to do with it. Ironically, some of my most brilliant brainstorms came to me in the middle of the night. I had a paper and a pen beside my bed, and I would just write a few words, and it always came back to me. Now, in the morning, it didn't always seem so brilliant, but in the middle of the night, it did. You need to write. You need to get it down. And while you're doing that, don't wait until it's done to start exploring what your options are going to be for publishing, because there are many possibilities now. Some will take away your rights as an author, as you well know, DC, and some of them you maintain total control, but you need to understand all of those things. And don't get taken by, as I did my first time around, I can make you a best-selling author. Just download this PDF for $500 and that kind of stuff. There's a process to getting your work out there. Put the best-selling author aside piece. What is your what, who is your who, and how are you going to get it to them? So if you know who your audience is going to be, your goal is to get that book into the hands of those readers and understand the process to get them there. So forget about all of these people who say they can do this, that, and everything else for you. Do your research. And if you need help, get experts in the field. If you need a publicist, hire a publicist. If you need an editor, you're going to hire an editor if you go indie route. So there's just so much to learn the first time through if you're about to embark. Get it down on paper and then think about your process as you're going forward. Take time every day or 3 times a week and go into your favorite place. Some people will go into libraries. Not all libraries are open now. Some people like to write in Starbucks with the music and their earbuds in their ear. So it's whatever works for you. Get the writing down on paper. And I mean on a computer. On a computer.
You can get it on paper and then transition to a computer. Just put it somewhere.
Yeah. You can use speech and language technology to do that. If somebody wants to handwrite it, you just read it into your computer and it transcribes it for you now. I mean, there's all kinds of tools.
There's options everywhere. The best advice I heard is the world needs your words out there. Put the words out. I was very moved by that. I was like, that is so true.
That's much more straightforward than my little run on there.
I enjoy your message. It made sense. And a lot of the times we hold ourselves back from putting things out there. So yes. Switching gears, Madame, who is your favorite author?
I have to say Paula Hawkins. I do. When I was writing Jackson, I was trying to mirror how Paula Hawkins, as you're reading her books, you have to figure out who the characters are. I didn't end up following the way she does it, but she certainly inspires me. I loved Into the Water, Girl on the Train, Paula Hawkins.
Absolutely. Do you have a favorite book?
Oh my goodness. So I go back to, I was a John Grisham and Patterson crime series kind of addict, but now I'm actually interviewing authors a little bit like you are. Some of my clients are authors and I'm doing book reviews every month. So I've really expanded. I'm going to say my favorite book right now is from a local author named Jen Sadie, and it's Women Who Rise. And she brought forward the story of 20 women who all experienced trauma and crisis in their lives, but they all found a way out and they're leading phenomenal lives right now. So it was a truly uplifting story that really connects to the kind of work that I do. I loved it. Jen Sadie, Women Ready to Rise.
Nice. Are you already working on your next project?
No, I am so focused on the book launch right now. I've got a book launch team, which is fantastic. We just put up the registration for the online Zoom party. I'm postponing doing an in-person signing right now. But no, the book launch is really consuming my time and my podcast as well. So
those are beautiful things. What is your podcast? Do tell us that before I forget. What is the name of your podcast and where can we find it?
Well, it's interesting because it links to the first book, which was called Steering Through It. And then I came up with the name Taking the Helm. My husband and I actually met in the Naval Reserve. So there's a back connection there. It took me, I'd say, 4 or 5 interviews to really figure out my why, but it is now. It's very, very clear. I'm interviewing people who have gone through crisis or crises in their lives, and they didn't know if they would survive. They didn't know how they would go on. Some of them with their personal life, some with their business, but they've all found new possibilities, and they're taking us all to a new understanding. The most difficult interview I did last week was a woman who lost her son to suicide 10 years ago in the military. It's the first interview I've done around that. That was the most challenging. But now she's written a book and she's telling her story. She is trying to help the families of suicide survivors understand a process. She takes us back to his childhood and really through flashbacks to bring us to what happened where she was trying to discover and figure out what happened. So that was the most difficult interview. But all of the other ones are, there are people who've survived an eating disorder or a life-threatening illness or cancer, or they were unhappy in their jobs. They were binge drinking. They did things that were unhealthy and they had to find their way out. There's just so many stories.
As a podcaster to another podcaster, thank you for what you do. I love it.
Appreciate that. You as well.
Are you ready, Madame? We're switching gears.
Okay, I'm ready.
We're going to our lightning round. Easy, fun. Don't think too much about it. I'm testing new questions, so let's see how we do. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Thin crust or stuffed pizza?
Stuffed pizza.
Okay. Ebooks or print?
Oh, ebook now. I have to blow things up at my age.
I like that. I need to remember that. That's a good point.
I mean, I don't mean blow things up. I mean enlarge.
I'm glad we're clarified that. That could be dangerous.
Yes.
Skiing or swimming?
Swimming.
Sweet. Here's a new one. Let's see how you like it. If you had a choice, if you could be a knight or a pirate, what would you be?
A knight.
Ooh.
Oh, yes.
Here's our last one. Let's see how we do it. If you could be any character in a Disney movie, what would you pick?
Oh, that's a tricky one. A Disney movie. Under the sea, under the sea. What's the name of the character?
Little Mermaid?
Ariel? Ariel. Ariel. There's my memory issue with my brain tumor piece that kicked in there.
You are doing amazing because I have memory issues and I don't have a brain tumor condition that I can relate it back to. So I'm like, you're doing much better than I am. Any message you would like to leave our readers before we go?
Keep on reading, branch out, and try to discover new pieces, new authors, as I did, finally leaving Grisham. And I haven't left Grisham and Patterson behind, but I'm obviously experimenting and discovering indie authors who have phenomenal work. So look outside of traditional publishers, look to genres that you enjoy, but reach out into something that might be new for you with a new experience, because those new experiences will take us each to a new understanding so that we can get to a place in our world where we're more empathetic, we're more understanding of each other. We ask questions to better understand rather than judging. So increasing our awareness and understanding through reading is one way that we can do that.
Madam, beautiful advice. Thank you for that. Where can our listeners find you before we go?
I'm at lynnmclaughlin.com. Everything is there through the drop-down pages. If you're interested in Jackson, go to lynnmclaughlin.com. There's a drop-down page specifically for Jackson with the trailer on there. And I have to give Frances Yap from Toronto credit for that. It is remarkable. I say it rocks. That's all I can say about that trailer. And you'll find everything about me there. Where to buy Jackson, all of the different links, the podcast, my Time to Publish series. It's all there.
Beautiful, beautiful. Madam, it has been such a pleasure to have you on this show. Thank you so much for joining us.
It's been my pleasure, DC. Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. We need to definitely do it again because I know you're going to be busy. And to our listeners, go ahead, give this podcast a like, share it with your friends, invite others to join us in the community. And thank you so much for an amazing time with us. We'll see you again next week for another passionate author. Have a great day, everyone.